We have more guests. Hey y'all, this is Adam with the Inkstain channel. Thank you so much for joining me for this one. This just dropped a few days ago. And I'm always torn about whether I want to try and be more of your standard reaction video format or if I want to bring you something different. And I generally fall on the side of doing something a little different. And most of that is because I'm a researchaholic. But this is so cool. I want to share some stuff about Elvenpath in general in a response to this new ElvenJig and Elvenpath live in Bogota video. So this song is not just a love letter to Tolkien, which is the way so many reactors tend to express it. And they're not wrong, but it's more than that. This song strikes me as a love letter to an entire era of fantasy and fantasy literature, which came from the influence of Tolkien. We've got references to Finnish folklore. We've got references to Forgotten Realms, which sort of had its onset in the late 80s. We've got music stylistically, which is reminiscent of late 80s movies. We know how influenced Tuomas is by soundtrack. We've also got references to some of the movies within that era, which kind of reinforces some of the stylistic choices musically. It's just overall really cool and really kind of a straightforward chorus, which brings it all into perspective. So let's first, we'll enjoy ElvenJig, which shows some great pipe work with Troy and the guys. And then that'll lead us right into Elvenpath. So let's get into it. And this, of course, is from the Decades Tour. Clearly, the audience is here for it.
That sounds nice.
Yeah, it does sound nice. Is it just me or is Troy like, oh, damn, I'm supposed to be on stage? Oh, cool harmonics. Oh, I didn't notice that before. He's playing down below his bridge. Shout out to the roadie that just sort of walked through the camera. You go, brother. And Marco is such a phenomenal bassist. It's often easy to forget what a great guitarist he is. Okay, now hear the tone of Tuomas' synth here, because that's going to be relevant. God, nobody blends metal and folk the way that these gentlemen do. You know, I'm going to pop it here for a second and just reiterate something that I've said before. If you were to put NIGHTWISH, for example, on Pandora or Spotify or even Apple Music, any of those things where you can sort of create your own radio station, but where they add music that's like the name of the artist that you name your channel after, like, NIGHTWISH Radio, and then they're going to put a bunch of stuff on that playlist that is technically of the same genre. If you do an experiment and try that, and you'll hear a bunch of bands that are not NIGHTWISH, and you'll get the impression, oh yeah, that kind of sounds like NIGHTWISH. And then NIGHTWISH will come on, and it's so evident that nothing really actually sounds like these guys and this lady who will be coming on in a moment. There are a lot of things that sound almost like NIGHTWISH, but nothing really sounds like NIGHTWISH except NIGHTWISH. Okay, here we hear that synth tone again.
The sheltering shade. Calling, calm in silence. Accompanied only by the full moon. The howling of a night wolf.
Okay, we're going to go back into that in a minute. And when Floor comes in, oh, it's so powerful when she goes into that deep register to do her narration. She does it again in Greatest Show on Earth. I know that video will come eventually, but she's got such presence and such power, and she sounds so much like the Queen. I mean, she is in command when she brings that register into the narration, into the spoken parts that we hear in various tunes that require that of her. It's just so worthwhile. So I want to take it back a little bit to the synth line that we're going to get right before she comes on, because I'm going to tie that into something in a minute.
The sheltering shade of the forest. Calling, calm in silence. Accompanied only by the full moon.
This line.
The howling of a night wolf. And the path under my bare feet. The Elvenpath.
This keyboard line. Okay. I pointed that keyboard line out because it is incredibly reminiscent of a certain period of soundtrack music in fantasy films. Down on the bottom, speaking of down on the bottom, if you like what we do here, hit like, give us that like, it helps us out. hit subscribe. That always helps too. More subscribers we get, the more I can keep bringing you videos. If you like what we do here. If you don't, that's cool too. Express yourself, hit that dislike. I love to communicate with you guys back and forth in comments too, as you know. But getting back on topic, down there, I provided a link to a soundtrack from an 80s fantasy film called Lady Hawk. Now, the minute I heard this, I'm like, holy crap. That sounds like one of the most popular fantasy films of that period. Michelle Pfeiffer, Rutger Hauer, Matthew Broderick. Great movie, phenomenal movie, right up Tomas's alley in terms of the type of stuff that he has expressed a fondness for. It sounded to me like all of these great fantasy soundtracks of the time that were sort of synthesizer based, leading up to and including the Tangerine Dream soundtrack for Legend. It's a whole period of time, and that's going to be reinforced with some narration we're going to get here in a minute. But I wanted to point that out to you. If you're old like me, it is not just a love letter lyrically, but stylistically to a certain period of fantasy film, which would have been right in that time period for when Tuomas would be getting into fantasy, sci-fi, fantasy literature, fantasy movies. He references a whole bunch of them here. One of the things that I want to point out is in the lyrics, we're going to get him referred to a whole bunch of stuff which is literature based. We've got Forgotten Realms references. We've got folklore references, which would have been things he might have heard in Finland as a child. We've got references to Tolkien, of course, gotta have those. We've got references to Beauty and the Beast, which is right at the core of his romantic sensibility. But he also references the film Willow, which was a film. Now, George Lucas and a collaborator later turned that into a book series, but the movie came first. And so it's that genre, both in literature and film. And that's going to be clear here that this is a love letter to both of those things. Let's get back into it. This is so 80s. It's metal. It's so metal, but it's so 80s fantasy movie.
Music from the deepest forest, songs of seduction, sirens, elf is calling me. Tapio begging, color of the forest, Mielikki, Bluecloak, heal my feelings, says open the gate and let me follow the uncarven path.
Okay. Now, excuse me. I looked a bunch of this stuff up. It seems to me like in that verse, those are all references to characters that may not only appear in Finnish folklore, but do appear in Finnish folklore. And then back into that refrain. Now, something I want to point out. I'm not saying Tuomas is doing this, but again, it's not necessarily an interpretation what the writer intended, in as much as it's what we as the audience bring to it and how it makes us feel. What he's talking about in terms of the honesty of these words, up until I would say the mid to late 1990s, fantasy and fantasy literature was very cut and dried. You had good, you had evil. Now, in the 50s, we did have some characters, and moving forward with certain writers, I'll reference Michael Moorcock as one of them. Some of the pulp fantasy writers, more so than the epic fantasy writers, who developed this idea of the anti-hero. And I may discover some more songs from Nightwish along my journey, which deal with some of those anti-hero characters that emerged in each decade, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. There are other musicians that wrote music in reference to them. One that comes to mind is Thomas Covenant, this character, the leper messiah, which we know David Bowie referenced in Ziggy Stardust. But this cut and dried good versus evil, there isn't a lot of gray area. There isn't a lot of nuance. It's the honesty of heroes and mighty swords and good guys versus bad guys. And it's such a poignant thing for Tuomas to say here, that idea, heroes, mighty swords, make him long for the past, where things were black and white. No gray area, good versus evil. And we're going to get some more of that coming up. But again, that genre in film is very much typified by the fantasy films from like 1980 onwards. And 1980 is important, and we'll see that in a second.
The moonwitch took me to a ride on a broomstick, introduced me to girlfriend Elvenglow, told me to keep the sauna warm for a
The
day.
sauna.
With bronze and leather as the fall, 'cause my fantasies build those small hot garments of jigs, each snowman, willow, trolls, and the seven dwarfs.
Okay, we know about Tuomas's love for the holiday movie, The Snowman. Wanted to point that out. Now we're sort of moving a little bit more into movies and how that path, there's just so many. It's almost like if you were writing an article and saying, there's too many to mention, it kind of feels like Tuomas's way of doing that. The path goes forever on. The honesty of these worlds, ruled by magic and mighty swords. Now here's where 80 becomes important.
Long ago, the early years of the second age, the great elven smiths forged rings of power.
Okay. Why is 1980 important? Wow. Okay. 1979, 1980, there were a bunch of movies that came out, animated movies, about The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Now, many of us are familiar with the musical version of The Hobbit that came out, produced by Rankin and Bass, and included such songs as The Greatest Adventure, folk music, versions of the songs that were included by Tolkien in The Hobbit. And Glenn Yarborough is the one who did that music. And I could so relate because I was about 5 or 6 years old when the Rankin Bass, wow. I'm so excited. I can't even talk properly. The Rankin Bass version of The Hobbit came out. It actually came out on film. It was an animated film, cartoon. We all know Thomas loves cartoons or the animated style of films because there's so much you can do with it that you're not constrained by budgetary restrictions, and it incorporates also that visually artistic element of drawing and painting, which we know he is a fan of. So not only was it The Hobbit, it was The Hobbit with songs, and it was folk music. And they released the film, but they also released a 4-album or 4-disc album version of the entire thing. It included the songs. It included the entire soundtrack, dialogue included, of the Rankin Bass, The Hobbit. 4 vinyl albums, 4 vinyl discs of everything, every piece of dialogue, every song, just a recording of the entire audio track of the movie. I would not be surprised if Tuomas experienced that, because it blends so many things that make we musician types happy. Vinyl, albums, fantasy, music, all of that together. It was very much an influence on me as a writer, and it was so integral to my growing up. It also inspired me to get into role-playing games, which were an escape. It was that escape to that world of magic and mighty swords, the honesty of those worlds where there was good, there was evil, no gray area, as I mentioned before. But also, there was the Rankin Bass Hobbit, but Rankin and Bass were unable to secure the rights to the first 2 books of The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers. Those rights were secured by Ralph Bakshi, another animator in a totally different style. And I've included because it's the narrative comes right from that movie, the voiceover narrative in the male voice comes right from that Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings, which was put out in 1980. This is why 1980 is important. So the first 2 books of The Lord of the Rings were animated in a movie by Ralph Bakshi, which was not musical, which was very dramatic and very stylistic, highly stylized and brilliant. Bakshi, however, did not secure the rights to Return of the King. Rankin Bass had Return of the King. So if you go through the whole deal, you get The Hobbit, Rankin Bass with songs. Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, directed by Ralph Bakshi, no songs, quite serious, very stylized. And then you get Return of the King, Rankin Bass with songs, notably among them the immortal classic, Where There's a Whip, There's a Way. Look it up yourself. I can't even. So that era in animated fantasy is very potent for people of my generation, which is also Thomas's generation. So all of those things put together may add a little bit of perspective to what's going on lyrically, musically, stylistically, and influentially within this piece. Let's get back into it and finish it off.
As I return to my room, and the sleep takes me by my hands, magic calls from the woods, carry me into
So there with you.
in this bed of night. The words are never sight. In this bed of night, the words are never sight.
But then the Dark Lord learned the craft of ring-making, made the master.
Go ahead, Ampu. Fills me with such joy. Such joy. Okay, so again, this is how I interpret all of this. Interpretation's always what the viewer, the listener, the reader, the consumer brings to it. Could be right, could be wrong, but I think I got a bunch of evidence to back me up on this one. The intentional choices that are made stylistically, the choices of the narration coming from the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings, I think that lends credence to that idea. I added links to, if you want to check out the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings, I know it's available for rent or download on YouTube. Can't violate copyright by throwing that out to you, but it's available. You can check out the style of it. I included a link to Lady Hawk's score and soundtrack, so you can sort of hear where I'm going with that influential element. And it just takes me back. It just takes me back to my 10-year-old Dungeons and Dragons playing self, going to bed and dreaming of elven princesses. Thank you so much for taking this time, spending it with us on the Inkstain channel. Remember, if you like what we do here, smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, hit the bell so you're notified of videos that we put up and when they're out. So did I just say out? Yeah, weird. Hit that bell so that you know when a new video is dropped and you can join us on our journey through the dreamscape that is Nightwish. Thank you, as always. I love getting your comments. I love interacting with you. This is a community. As always, thank you to the Nightwish Army who has shown us such love and support. Y'all, one other thing. Virtual experience. Nightwish just let it out there. March 12th and 13th, live virtual experience. I'm so there for that. Based on the love of animation and all things fantastical, I cannot wait to see what they have in store for us as an experience. As always, remember, your words have power, so use them wisely. Take care of your mind, body, and spirit, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video. Take care.